everybody, and welcome to the channel. In today's video, we have an absolutely brilliant presentation by esteemed astrologer Gray Crawford titled Solar Storytelling, the Sun in Secondary Progressions. Our spring term semester is in full swing, but it's not too late to sign up for classes, whether you're interested in our full diploma program, our certificate programs, or individual classes you may wish to take to add to your astrological toolbox. We have a class for everybody. We also have a number of fantastic workshops and webinars. So if you'd like to learn more, please visit KeplerCollege.org. And without further ado, let's get into the video.
So today we're going to really just focus in on the sun in secondary progressions as a way, if you're new to the topic, this will hopefully help you understand just what secondary progressions is without getting too overwhelming by bringing a bunch of all the other planets into it. And if you already are familiar with secondary progressions, I am going to be going through a lot of details and a couple maybe more advanced techniques. So there should still be things for you to learn here. If you're not familiar with what secondary progressions are, we are working with the sun. The sun is really the main primary symbolism behind secondary progressions and the way it works. We're taking a correspondence between our experience of one solar day with our experience of one solar year. So if we're calculating a progress chart for somebody who's about 40 years old, we're looking at the chart 40 days after their birth. And we'll talk a little bit more about, what is that symbolism and why does that work? So really, to start with, where we are talking about the sun. And just if we, now we have all these clocks, obviously, and phones and things showing us the time around us all the time, almost constantly. But, the sun has always been known as a primary timekeeper. Our ancestors constructed stones, circles, reflecting the changing time of the sun throughout the course of the year with the different seasons. There's a real felt sense that we all have of the sun and the quality of the sun's light and nature changing as we move through spring and summer and fall and winter. And just within a day, we have the same experience, just that felt power of watching the sunrise and shifting from darkness and night into this changing colors of the sky and, daybreak, as well as the power of watching the sun setting into night. And again, there's those changing colors and we go into the darkness of night. And if you're in the northern hemisphere like I am right now, and now we're in spring, we can really feel that life-giving nature of the sun and how we're having this increased solar radiance in our lives, and we're having an increase, that driving colors and flowers, out of the soil, and life is really emerging in brighter ways. Different cultures have different deities and divinities that can be masculine or feminine that are associated with the sun. To the Greeks, it's Helios. Often, like Helios, it's a deity or divinity that is being pulled by horses or stallions in a chariot across the sky. And I think the Orphic hymn to Helios, if you're familiar with that, it has some nice language that really connects in with the sun as this timekeeper, which is how it really plays out with secondary progression. Some of the phrases in the Orphic hymn to Helios includes it being a life-giving and the sun being fruit-bearing, that the sun tempers the season as the sun is riding with its dancing horses, holding this golden lyre that holds the harmony of cosmic motion, which is both commanding noble deeds as well as nurturing the seasons, being this eternal, pure father of time. This text here is from the Yellow's Emperor's Inner Classic, which is one of the most important texts in Chinese medicine. It might be from around 220 BC. It's very ancient. And one thing about the idea of secondary progressions we'll talk a little bit more about is this really did become a lot more popular in the 20th century astrology, although the idea of it does predate the 20th century astrology. But the actual symbolism of the solar day for a solar year is really one of the most ancient concepts around the sun and time that we really have. In this text, it states one day can be divided according to 4 seasons. Sunrise is spring, midday is summer, sunset is autumn, and midnight is winter. And so this is really the fundamental idea that we're working with here. And it's why we then take this symbolic resonance of this one solar day. So our experience again of the sun rising and culminating, setting, going through midnight and back up again, with our experience of how it seems like the sun is going around us on the ecliptic and, traveling around the entire zodiac belt in our experience of one solar year. And so again, if somebody's 30 years old, we're looking at a chart that is about 30 days after they're born. So if you think about somebody living to be about 90 years old, we're thinking like 90 days after the birth. Where is everything moving from that natal birth time through those first few months of the person's life? And so this idea of the sun day and the sun year, we are talking about a fractal here. And so I think there's also a really interesting conceptual way to think about it in terms of fractals, chaos theory, and even in ancient thought, this idea of the part equaling the whole has been around for a long time. And bringing awareness to that part is illuminating the vaster whole. And so when we apply this technique to certain parts of our life, we are then illuminating the whole vaster whole of our entire story. And so it really helps us show the meaning of how our story, how our identity is changing across time. So it's not so much about that frozen moment of the natal chart, which, a lot of us get really fixated on for good reason and maybe identify really strongly with particular placements or aspects in our chart. Secondary progressions is connecting us to that flow of all the cycles, everything constantly moving and changing, the different planetary cycles and how they're relating to one another, how that goes with the constant flux and things coming into being and passing away again, just in our daily life. And so again, they can be very exact with events where you can have the exact, progressed moon comes to the natal Mars or Venus, and something exact on that day will actually sometimes happen that is very revealing and makes sense with that particular aspect. And the other thing, though, that I think that they are especially powerful for are these larger story arcs. And that's what I'm going to be talking about more today, and how they can really help pinpoint these times of liminal thresholds of things changing, especially the internal states that are going on within us. And if we're thinking about then how that natal chart is keying us into this greater potential that's going to manifest in our life, secondary progressions are helping us show the timing of that, as well as the sort of shape shifting and changes that we're going through. Like I mentioned, it is an older idea. There's actually some writing in Vettius Valens at one point. He's a 1st century astrologer, where it sounds like he is actually talking about secondary progressions, but he's talking about in a different context. But he is talking about counting days after the life and applying that to the chart for particular years. At one point, Johannes Kepler had an idea of, tracking how many days after the person's birth does it take the sun to get to a planet, and then you could equate that to years. But my awareness is it's really Placidus, the astrologer that gets associated with that Placidus house cusp system, that develops this idea more. And the idea of secondary progressions, you might be familiar with primary directions, and if you're not, don't worry about it. But that's partially my understanding is why it's called secondary progressions, because he had a little more focus on that primary directions. And if you're familiar with primary directions, we're talking about the diurnal motion of the sun from the moment you're born. So, a few hours after your birth on that particular day is equating to, like the lifetime. This is different because we're talking about, a day for a year. So I really like secondary progressions, especially because of that. I like seeing this greater arc of the cycles of the planets and where they're moving when you're born and how that then plays out across your lifetime. And I think that it really connects strongly with this idea of spirals, cycles, things being non-linear, and how our conception of the past can actually change. How we tell our past story will actually change across time, which changes our experience of the present as well as the future. And there's something really fascinating about secondary progressions and looking at it and talking to people about their life and what that sparks about them, their sense of themselves. And it tends to really lead into these great insights in this way. So if we, again, think about that natal chart as maybe the seed of dynamic potential, secondary progressions are really helping us show, just how we're becoming this maybe new person, but also a sense of even returning to this deeper sense of ourself. And the idea of the self connected to the work of Carl Jung, depth psychology, I really also think that works really well. And it's interesting also that as those ideas became more popular and got connected to astrology in the 20th century, secondary progressions also became such a powerful technique. You might be familiar with Jung's idea of individuation, and that, this idea of a mountain pine, the seed of that mountain pine has latent in that seed, the whole form of the pine. And of course, there's always going to be environmental factors at play and how that tree grows, but there's something really primal within that seed. And so there's something about that inner, however you want to talk about that inner force within us that's part of our character and helping shape who we are and who we're meant to be with our sense of destiny and fate and so forth. Those inner changes, internal shifts, there's something about that I think secondary progressions are especially powerful for helping us attune to. Jung has a very famous quote where he talks about there's no linear evolution. There's only circumambulation of the self, kind of going around that self. And I think that idea fits really well, again, with secondary progressions being timed to the solar movement between a day versus a year. If that was too much for you to kind of follow along with, don't worry about it. I like sometimes just breaking down the symbolism of secondary progressions. One thing about it, just to kind of, if you're really new to this topic, is just at first just to trust the fact that this does work, and that counting days after somebody's birth really does show up really well with how their story changes. And I'll be giving you a lot of examples of that. But what this means is you don't actually have to even know somebody's exact time of birth and have a birth chart to work with secondary progressions. I am going to be using exact charts today. So having an exact chart is very helpful for a lot of reasons. But even if somebody didn't know their birth time and they just knew their birthday, you can still use this technique to find some important periods of change and help them kind of get insight into different chapters of their life. So maybe they're not going to be able to use something like Fractal or zodiacal releasing or some of these other techniques where you actually, especially zodiacal releasing, you really have to know the exact time of the birth. So if just knowing their birth, if you just open up an ephemeris and you're counting certain days equaling certain years, some of the things you're tending to look for are when a planet is stationing, either direct or retrograde. That's going to usually signify something big changing. Of course, the sun and the moon don't do that, so we're not going to talk about that today. Anytime the planet is changing signs or crossing house cusps, and especially if it does come to one of those angles, the ascendant, the midheaven, the descendant, or the imam coeli, and I will be talking about that. Of course, crossing house cusps does depend upon what house system you use. I am somebody that does use the whole sign house system as well as quadrant systems. I tend to use Placidus. So I am going to be showing you some examples of both whole sign and Placidus. And I'm somebody that strongly feels both of these work. And I'll give you some examples of just showing how the timing will depend upon which one of those systems you're using. Also, looking for when somebody's going to experience a new moon, a full moon, other lunation phase changes. There's a whole story that tells. We're not going to get into that today, as well as looking for when are the different planets forming new aspects or forming conjunctions with natal planets, as well as when they're doing the same thing with other planets that are moving by progression. And we are going to talk about those last two things today with the sun. So one thing when we're just talking about the sun in secondary progressions is, of course, just thinking about what is the sun in astrology. So natal astrology, we're talking about the sun. We're talking about our central source of vitality, life force, intelligence, this very active intelligence that's creative, that involves our leadership, our authority. It illuminates our core purpose. It is that central luminosity that's radiating your intellect, your soul's light into the surrounding world. It involves how you're taking initiative to direct and focus your consciousness, towards things like achievement, public reputation. So in secondary progressions, the sun really takes on a really primary role because it is so steady. The other planets will change at different speeds, and it again really depends upon when you are born. So if you were born with Mercury stationing at your birth, you're somebody born with Mercury not really moving. It's going to very slowly start changing as you grow up. Or somebody else might have it born with Mercury moving really fast. And so they're going to have a lot of change with Mercury happening right away in their progressed chart. The sun for everybody moves about 1 degree per year. And so it sets this very steady course, which all the other cycles of the planets are revolving around through secondary progressions. And so it's really showing this course of our internal essence, both coming into being, as well as returning to alignment with our authentic character. Just like the sun produces fruit and flowers and growth out of the soil, we can think about how this really cultivates and brings life to the soil of our own being. And that when it does change signs and it does change houses, which is something we are going to talk about, this will signify major new chapters in that person's life. There's often a change in not only internal state, but also external life direction and perceptual understanding. Of course, our perceptual understanding can often be changing, but these are major shifts and major kind of new chapters of our story of our perceptual understanding and how we put things together with our direction and identity that really come in when there's a big change in the sun. So again, the sun, when we're looking at this, we're going to think about it's always going to move about 1 degree per day. So it's always moving about 1 degree per year in progressions. It makes the sun the easiest thing to work with in secondary progressions because it's the most consistently moving. So again, it's going to take 30 years. Think about each sign is 30 degrees. It's going to take 30 years to move through a whole sign. So if you live to be 90, you're going to live through the sun moving across 90 degrees. And so what this means is to start thinking about initially is the fact that wherever you are born with your sun, it is going to be changing signs. As you grow up, it's also going to be changing houses. Again, house system does matter as far as how many houses it's going to change, which we'll talk about, but it does create these patterns that we all have. So people that are born as a Pisces, they have their sun in Pisces. Pisces sun people are going to always move through having an Aries sun and then a Taurus sun. And perhaps some of them will actually also get a Gemini sun. And so there's a meaning of that. What does that mean? That everybody that's a Pisces sun goes to Aries, goes to Taurus, might go to Gemini, or a Leo sun, that Leo, ultimate expression of the sun is going to move through a 30-year Virgo phase, followed by a period of being in Libra. And somebody could have an entire 30 years of their sun in Libra who's born as a Leo. Or a 10th house sun they're going to move always then through the 11th house. And that 10th house sun, which we might think of as being especially prominent or really seen in the world, is going to always move into the 12th house. Well, often does, you know, it depends on how long somebody lives and so forth. Whereas a 12th house sun is always going to then move into the 1st house, and often, you know, directly across that ascendant and into the 2nd house. So that this does mean that there's something about the meaning of the sun that is changing, that we're seeing with secondary progressions. But the key point that we'll be talking about here today is that you need to root the interpretation of that progressed sun in that radical nature of the natal sun. So pay attention to what's that condition of the natal sun, what house is it in, what house does it rule, what's that dynamic potential it's suggesting. Secondary progressions are going to show how things are changing with the person, but they're not going to do something that's, you know, completely radically different than what the natal promise, or, you know, what's saying in a natal chart. So that's one thing that you sort of have to, as you get used to using secondary progressions, you have to keep in mind how to go, you know, you need to have a foot in each of these realms of the natal chart as well as the secondary progressed chart as you're working with it. So I'm going to give a few just quick examples of that last statement about that you need to make sure you are paying attention to that sun in the natal chart. And what does that mean? So this is Meryl Streep's chart. Meryl Streep is a famous actress, especially, you know, in the 1980s became known as sort of the most celebrated leading actress in Hollywood. And, you know, she's continued to work up until now in prominent leading roles. So she has a 12th house sun. Now in Placidus, you can see it's a 0-degree sun conjoining Uranus. So in these examples, the inner wheel is going to be the natal chart, and the outer wheel is going to be the secondary progressed chart, you know, stopped at a particular time to show what I'm talking about. I'm somebody that would say, using Placidus, that Meryl Streep has actually a very strong 12th house sun because her sun is so close to that 12th house cusp. I know there might be some of you that wouldn't say that, but I would say even in Placidus is an extremely strong 12th house sun. For those of you that use whole sign, you'd also be saying she has a 12th house sun because she's Leo rising. So the important thing about Meryl Streep, one is that sun is conjoining Uranus very, very closely, almost to the minute. I mean, it's a sun-Uranus exact conjunction. Another really major aspect she has is that sun in Cancer forming a sextile to Saturn in Virgo, which perhaps goes with, you know, just her dedication to her craft and all the hard work she's put in over the years. So the key thing here, though, with this example is she is Leo rising. Leo rising, being a Leo rising ascendant, there's something, you know, who she is, there's an essential Leo quality to who she is. The sun actually is the ruler of that ascendant. And so being a 12th house sun, when she, by progression, lived to her secondary progressed sun moving to the ascendant. So that's what we're seeing here on this chart. This happened around January 21st of 1983. In her life, this really did go with her coming into great prominence, great visibility to a higher level than she had before. She had been actually very successful as an actress before this, but also had had a lot of supporting roles. She'd already won Oscars for supporting actresses. But as the sun comes to her ascendant, she starts taking on leading actress roles in, you know, big major films. And a few months after she gets that exact sun on her ascendant, which is also around the time of a new moon on her ascendant, you can see the sun and moon close together on her ascendant, she actually wins her first Oscar as the best leading actress for the film Sophie's Choice. So again, there's a little extra quality there to me about that Leo rising, as well as other factors going on in her life. but that's to me more about that quality of that meaning there. Another example of another 12th house sun is another actress, is Jodie Foster. So Jodie Foster is also a 12th house sun, Scorpio sun. She has her Mercury very close to her sun, going in towards the superior conjunction with the sun. And again, in a Placidus house system, this is an extremely strong 12th house sun, right on the cusp of that 12th house, would also be 12th house in whole sign. So when her progressed sun comes to her ascendant, this is in September of 1983. So she is somebody that already had achieved fame as a child actress and had already been in a bunch of major films. But a few years before this, so as that sun is coming to her ascendant, she took a break from taking on a lot of big roles and went to Yale University to earn her degree. So one thing about her that's important with that meaning of the sun in her chart is she has a sun in the 12th, but it rules her Leo house, right? Her Leo in Placidus is 9th house. It would also be 9th house in whole sign. So we have this 9th house quality of higher education, among other things, that sun rules. And as it comes to her ascendant, she thinks it's really important for herself, to go back to school and earn this degree. And in terms of it, also the sun moving from, the end of that 12th house journey, crossing the ascendant, you might know that soon after she started attending Yale, she had that really famous stalker incident where there was a stalker who then attempted to assassinate the president. And then that was in order to impress her. And this is, a couple of years after that. So I'm sure there must have been something internally significant about this period. Obviously, her taking that time to get her Yale degree, and she goes on to do a lot of other things in her life that degree, I'm sure, helped her. And she still was public. So, for example, the summer break of this time period, she was in this television film called Svengali, and this picture is actually from that. So she still was doing some visible things, but this was more about herself and, going back to school and getting this higher education degree when it crosses her ascendant. And so one more example to show another one. This is Michelle Pfeiffer, who's Gemini rising with a Taurus sun. Again, very 12th house, right on that 12th house cusp in Placidus. If you look at her midheaven is Aquarius, her IC is Leo, about 24 degrees of Leo. And so that Taurus sun rules the IC, rules her 4th house, which does, among other things, relate to family. She has the sun for her come to her ascendant April 1st, 1995. This image actually is just one I found from a few months after that. She was on the cover of a magazine, and you can see it says "One Strong, Sexy Mother." And this is because she had recently given birth to her first child. So she had already been seen out in the world, prior to this for a while. But when the actual sun crosses the ascendant, it definitely is also bringing alive that 4th house quality. About a year, 1993 time period, she had actually gone through adoption proceedings to adopt a daughter. And then around the same time, she gets involved in a relationship with the producer David Kelly. They end up getting married. In fact, her adopted daughter is christened at their wedding. And then she ends up becoming pregnant and then actually finally giving birth to her first child. And so her children were, she's known as somebody that her children were very important to her. And at different points in her life, she wasn't taking roles, to focus more on her family. As far as her outer career, not long before this, she had also formed her own production company. And so there is also very active in the world quality going on with her ascendant. And this is around the time that she co-produced and starred in the movie Dangerous Minds. This is also the last time Saturn was in Pisces. So some of you might be familiar with one of the hit songs from that time period was Gangsta's Paradise by Coolio, which was from this film. And she was in that music video. So, I mean, there was definitely things where she's still being seen out in the world in a big ways. But this period coinciding with her starting a family and having children and the sun ruling the IC, that's the part I just want to emphasize in terms of, you know, that natal chart and how that relates to the meaning of it. So again, what this means is you can think about this in a lot of different ways, but one of the most basic ways is, and when you're working with people, is to realize wherever they're born with their natal sun, they're going to go through these transitions. So a water sun is going to become a fire sun into an earth sun. And we all have these patterns, and you can think about, there's a lot of ways to think about this, which I'll give some examples showing that. And we can also think about the quadruplicity. So the cardinal suns are going to become fixed, become mutable, versus mutable cardinal fixed, and so on. Same thing with the sun moving houses from place to place. You know, and these are really, again, really interesting patterns to think about, you know, what does this mean? What does it mean that the 10th house sun is then going to go through an 11th house experience, and then that 10th house sun has to go into the 12th house of darkness and, you know, this more solitary inner exploration, versus a 12th house sun, right, emerging out of that, going across the first house into the second house, or a 6th house sun, you know, becoming a cadent sun, becoming very angular in the 7th house in a different way, and so on. So this is an example of somebody I've worked with that I'm just calling Rose for this, this anonymously for this webinar. You can see she is born, her natal chart is on the inside and her progress chart is on the outside. And this progress chart is for pretty much like right now, just from a few days ago. And she had come to meet with me because she actually was aware of the fact that her sun was soon going to be going into Taurus. And that was something she was really interested in and wanting to talk about. And so I thought that would be a really good example to share here. Because, you know, when we're at that final degree of a sun, so this means she's lived about, you know, 29 or so years. Her progressed sun has been in Aries since it's at the very, very end of Aries. And as we come to that end of the sign, there does tend to be this big culmination of that whole journey, as well as this sort of liminal threshold, you know, foreshadowing. That entrance into Taurus can already be, you know, felt, and the trajectory of the person's life is already moving in that direction, right? And so there's often really powerful internal things that they're thinking about and wondering about, and how that's going to play out. So in her chart, you can see she's a Pisces sun. She's born at a full moon. So her Pisces sun is pretty close to the descendant. I'm going to use whole sign actually for this example, partially because this is the way she thinks about her chart. And also, as I'll talk about, when the sun changes signs, that's one time I would suggest, even if you don't usually use whole sign, I would suggest taking a look. And if you're okay with getting into whole sign and can use whole sign, to bring in the meaning of the whole sign change, because it does show up with the meaning of that whole sign house change. So anyway, she has a Pisces sun. It's opposite the moon. You can see it is forming a square aspect with her Neptune, which is in Sagittarius down at the bottom of her chart, as well as it's squaring the angles of the midheaven and the IC. Also really relevant to what we're going to be talking about. Her sun is forming a sextile to Chiron, and it's also really close to her lot of fortune. So it's very active in terms of events, career, her body, you know, changing states of fortune and that sort of thing. One thing about her, with this shift to Taurus in the 9th house, which is highly relevant, is she is somebody that has increasingly become more and more of an astrologer, and shifting in that space from having more recently shifted from learning astrology to actually doing consultations in astrology. She's also somebody that works with herbalism. She's also an artist. She also does energetic work and also work specifically with ancestors and ancestral work connected to the spiritual astrology, just tarot. And these are things she's wanting to sort of more firmly establish herself in at the same time that her son's about to enter Taurus. So this is really relevant anytime somebody's moving actually from a fire sign to an earth sign. So breaking, Aries to Taurus just down elementally, if somebody's moving from a fire sign, either by progression or natally, into an earth sign, the sun's going to be going from this more fast moving, externally expressive, inspiring, energizing vitality and spirit of the fire sign. It's going to start slowing down to be more receptive and more discerning about how to solve problems. It's going to become more cautious and methodical instead of so impulsive and freedom seeking. It's going to be more interested in learning rules and getting structures in place and creating order. And so that enthusiasm and creativity, the fire element, can really be brought into more solid forms. There's can be more focus on practicality, pragmatism, grounding, making things more secure and stable. And that emphasis on security and stability is especially present when Aries goes to Taurus, because we're also speaking then about a fixed sign, which is also going to be more interested in that long-term plans that are really going to endure and be more stable. Whereas the Aries being much more, pioneering and really trying to dynamically assert things. So one thing that's how this relates to her life is that this journey across the 8th house, she has described as being, very difficult, but at the same time, the difficult experiences really opened up her spiritual practice, her spiritual awarenesses, all these different modalities that she works with all came in as she went through different difficult experiences associated with the 8th house. And, if we just think about, Virgo people having this Aries 8th house, this is that, really hidden occult section of their chart. And it does also relate to ancestors in terms of her getting into the ancestral practice. And, when she came to talk to me, she did have some fears about moving into Taurus, but also has shared, because she's gone through so much in this 8th house journey, she really doesn't have fears about what's going to be coming. And because has felt over this journey, this much more grounding into herself, she feels she's going to be somebody that can help people through their own, 8th house journey, of a dark night into the soul. So if you just kind of look at her natal chart, one thing you might notice is this is a person, if you look at the house opposite the 8th house, the 2nd house of Libra, this is a person that was born at a Saturn-Pluto conjunction that also had Mars retrograde in Libra nearby, which obviously brings some gifts as well as challenges. And what that means is her progressed sun, as part of this 8th house journey, would have moved across, an opposition with all of those Libra placements. And that, in fact, did, coincide with a lot of these big experiences. So one way to think about this is there's two things that you're looking at with progressions. One is you're looking at the secondary progressions forming aspects to the natal chart. And this is a way that Bernadette Brady talked about in her book, The Eagle and the Lark, that I've always liked. That, that's going to really bring up these new ways to deal with these older patterns that are associated with the natal chart. When we're talking about the progressed sun, typically that's going to be aspects with the natal chart. Now, it is possible that the progressed sun can come in and form a conjunction with a natal planet, and I'll have an example of that later. but you would have to be somebody born with planets, basically ahead of the sun, within reach of the sun by progression to experience that. The other thing that will happen is, instead of it being the progressed sun forming aspects with natal planets, it will do that with other progressed planets. And when that happens, instead of it being this kind of more radical, older, foundational natal aspect, it's something new coming in, a little bit more of a new thing, more of like an unconscious inner drive towards something. So back in March of 2014, this is a period when her progressed sun was in Aries in the 8th house. That's on the outer wheel. You can see that it is coming into an opposite. It's moving from an opposition with Mars retrograde in Libra into an opposition with the Saturn retrograde in Libra. And at the same time, her progressed Mercury is moving towards a conjunction with her sun. So we actually have two things at once happening here. We have the progressed sun in the process of forming a conjunction with her Mercury, which might be a more inner, thing coming through for her. She's born with a visible morning star Mercury in Aquarius. So that's very different. But at the same time, there's something about that, Mars, Saturn in her natal chart that is getting activated by this. This period of March, just where I set this chart, is sort of in the middle of a healing crisis she had, in which she had the spontaneous back injury, and she was in a lot of pain. She wasn't able to walk for about 6 months, and that actually predated this by a little bit. But during that process, around this time, is when she met her first spiritual teacher and mentor, who is going to help put her more on this path to bringing all these different modalities together that she's been developing since this time in the last 9 years or so. And then later she gets, then there's time going on through this. After this is when she gets into herbalism, and shamanic healing work came in a little bit more at that one that I just showed, and then herbalism also was coming in. And she then comes into this period here towards the end of 2019, when her progressed sun in Aries has now moved from being opposite Saturn into forming an exact opposition with her natal Pluto. And she actually has another healing crisis here, which involved her again not being able to walk. And this time it was for more about 8 months. But once again, she meets another spiritual mentor teacher, who's somebody that really could help her with everything in terms of herbs and ancestors, energy, sort of working with underlying energy dynamics of existence in a way. And so again, there's something really powerful, difficult event, but at the same time, this is really powerfully shaping her in the practice she's developing as the sun then starts moving across Aries into Taurus. So an example I'm going to give now of a celebrity who you might have already a picture in your mind of who they are and how the changes would line up with her life story is Nina Simone. And I am going to, with this one, I'll give an example of how to show the fact that you can look at this with Placidus versus whole sign. So with Nina Simone, if you don't know who she is, she's a legendary singer who was a child prodigy on piano from a very young age, was a prodigy and would play music all the time for her mother's church, turning into being classically trained as a classical musician, into eventually becoming a famous singer-songwriter who would also do covers and had a very unique style of combining that classical music education and talent with folk and jazz and blues and gospel and so forth. If we're using Placidus, she has actually a first house sun. So when we're thinking about the sun changing houses, she's going to have more of a experience of first house sun going to second house sun going to third house sun. But if we're using whole sign, she has a second house sun. And so then we're going to have a transition of second house to third house to fourth house. The reason I like looking at both is because I feel both are going on. And to me, I can see how the sun changing lines up with both of these. This is obviously up to you with your own preferences of, what house system you want to use. But I just want to show how work with both. Everybody here, he might use both different house systems. So this is showing here when we're using Placidus, and I don't know off the top of my head what the other quadrant system cusp is, but this is when her progressed sun hits the second house cusp using the Placidus house system, which is in early 1952. So some things about her sun, you can see she has a conjunction between sun and the dwarf planet Ceres. Her sun's pretty close to her north node. It's in the same sign as her lot of fortune, which is important. Again, it has that real, brings in that much more active quality with big life events. Her sun is opposite her south node of the moon, opposite her Neptune, opposite her Mars retrograde in Virgo. Also, whole sign opposite the Jupiter in Virgo as well. When she hits the second house cusp change in Placidus, there is a progressed full moon happening at the same time. If you look at the 8th house cusp on the outer wheel, you'll see her Virgo moon there. So this is a full moon progression happening, which tends to be a big illumination of meaning. Oftentimes, if people are on a trajectory of being known or doing something that's going to lead them to be known in the public, that can often come in during that time, which is certainly what happens with her. The progressed sun would have also just been moving out of an opposition with the natal Jupiter at this time. So the reason that this relates to the second house is I mentioned before that she had been studying classical music, and her actual real ambition had been to be a classical music like concertiste. And she had already gone to the Juilliard School and wanted to go to this Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. That was this very elite school to get into. And previous to this happening, she unfortunately did not get in, and it was very crushing to her. She thought racism could be involved possibly, but her whole family had actually moved to Philadelphia, sort of anticipating she was going to go to the school. And she did continue, on her own studying classical music and paying for instruction, but she realized she was going to have to start working and to also help support her family. And so she starts taking jobs, which one of the things that actually was involving teaching piano, but a bunch of other work and jobs. And so there's, on one sense, it relates to this, the sun moving in the second house. And then as it sort of establishes itself in the second house, it's a couple of years after this that she changes her name to Nina Simone, because she ends up hearing about the fact that you can go to Atlantic City and make money performing there. Because her mother was so religious, she grew up in this very Christian church environment. She knew her mom would think she was playing the devil's music, and she didn't want her mom to find out that she was going to do this. So she took the name Nina Simone, so that when it's being publicized, it wouldn't be her actual birth name. Interestingly, the name Nina was a nickname a boyfriend had given her, but the name Simone came from a character, or actually it might have been an actress. It was actually a French actress who she had seen in a 1952 film. So I thought that was kind of interesting because, she might have seen the film where she got the name Simone around the time, the sun goes into the second house, which is then going to connect with how she's making money and supporting herself and her family and her career. So what is going to happen then with Nina Simone? Ultimately, she's born with a Pisces sun. So she's going to go from this transition from Pisces sun into an Aries sun. This is one of the more complex transitions that we have, because if we're using that traditional paradigm of water signs being cold and wet, and fire signs being hot and dry. There's no common ground between them. And so Pisces or other watery people, they're going to be moving from being more receptive, allowing things to take shape a little bit more, to something that's more direct, fast. And that sort of inward, dissolving, mutating, coalescing quality of water is going to have to shift into this more radiant, enterprising, external expression, which can be difficult for a lot of water sun people to do, including Pisces water sign people. So it's interesting that this transition to Aries kind of comes in a way of I think helping water sign people, take on that quality more. And so, water signs, they're not so much about that external expression, because they're more about inward exploration of imagination and emotions, absorbing, synthesizing all these different diverse ideas and inspirations together. So this transition to the fire sign is going to be more about generating movement, and actually then creating more targeted goals. So out of that, watery solution, clarifying goals to really focus on it, breaking free, moving towards. And this particular shift that she goes through from mutable to cardinal also really supports that, because, mutable signs tend to be more about being very adaptable and flexible, having different things going on. And the cardinal signs, especially Aries cardinal, it's much more about, really initiate something. So this goes with the period following the period I was just mentioning, where, she shows up to Atlantic City, takes this other name, starts improvising on stage and creating this musical style. And by the time she gets to her Aries, her sun moving from Pisces into Aries, which is in October of 1960, the prior month, on September 11th of 1960, she was on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was the most major sort of like public attention on a TV show you could really get as a performer. The year before, in 1959, she performed this very famous concert that it's called Live at the Town Hall. And, that made her much more locally popular, where she became this very, one of the more popular favorite Greenwich Village performers. But she's also in this time period starting to tour. And like this flyer actually on this screen here is from October of 1960. So partially we have, she's learning how to be on stage, really performing, and she becomes, as her son's in Aries, one of the most dynamic, powerful performers ever in music, certainly in 20th century music. But also we can think about the third house and traveling. She's touring, she's moving from place to place. And so if you're somebody that doesn't use whole sign, I would just suggest that movement into the new sign does tend to really activate that topic. So in this case, we're talking about the third house of her chart. Additionally, another really big thing that happens here pretty soon after her sun goes into Aries is she meets Andrew Stroud, and they marry. He was a former police officer, and then he becomes her manager, and really puts her through a pretty grueling schedule of touring, and she starts touring a lot, and she was somebody that would perform to the point of exhaustion, but was making money. So that comes in there with that second house quality of her sun. And this, because she's Aquarius rising and having a Leo descendant, that sun rules the seventh house, which does connect to that marriage and relationship, which unfortunately was an abusive relationship that she later did, break herself free from. Something else that doesn't happen right here, but it happens a few years after this. Her first album had already come out, and she was already becoming very popular as a musician that civil rights activists like to listen to. But as her sun gets more and more into Aries, she becomes very activated by different church bombings and different civil rights leaders being murdered. And she becomes actually very directly active as in civil rights, actually writing very specific songs related to events and civil rights activism, and is a very fiery. We need to actually use violence if necessary to protect ourselves type of civil rights activist in a very kind of Aries, fiery way as she goes through that journey. So another transition that's, just to do a different one besides water to fire, another transitional space that is more complex because of not having things in common is going from earth into air. And that's again because of traditionally earth is cold and dry, air is considered hot and wet. There's no common ground. I'm going to give a couple examples for Capricorn to Aquarius, which in this case, there is at least the common ground that they're both ruled by Saturn, but elementally this earth to air, again, is a little bit more complex. So there's that, earth signs are going to be more methodical and cautious and a little bit more slow. And going into air, it's going to be a lot more active and dispersing and flexible and new directions, new ideas pursuing, more fluidity. And that central practical quality is going to become more intellectual, conceptual. Also more interest on being social, making intellectual connections, having these new ideas and perspectives coming in. And then in this particular one, we're again going from cardinal to fixed. So that more pioneering, initiating quality becoming more like, how do we really get something, create something stable that's going to really persist and bring in consistency. So another celebrity example that I think everybody knows, just to give a sense of this, is Martin Luther King. And thinking about the fact, so he is a Capricorn sun. This is his chart in Placidus with his Capricorn sun. You can see very close to his midheaven. But, he's 25 Capricorn, born at 25 degrees of Capricorn. Pretty early on in his life, he goes into an Aquarius sun. And so that shift from Capricorn, into Aquarius, much more interested in, on one hand, rebelling, fighting for civil rights, being intellectual, organizing groups, organizing bodies into something very consistent that's going to be able to fight through difficulties, in his case, with a civil rights activism. So if we're using a Placidus house system, his progressed sun moves across the 11th house cusp at the end of the 1950s. And this particular date that I put the progressed chart on is right when his progressed midheaven moves into Pisces. The progressed midheaven will move about the same rate as the sun. And so what we're going to talk about here is how he's eventually going to go from Aquarius sun into a Pisces sun. But it's sort of initiated here a bit as he's coming to the end of the Aquarius sun. His midheaven's moving into Pisces, like ahead of that. But as that sun is coming into cross that 11th house cusp in Placidus, he is doing things like organizing this Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Around this time, he's already been involved in the Birmingham bus boycotts. He, right around this date, he had moved back to Atlanta. He became involved with student sit-ins. He gets arrested. There's a presidential election going on where his arrest, which is what this photo's from, becomes a big issue within. And so this movement of his sun in Aquarius basically takes him through the years ahead of this as he gets, more into other protest movements, including to the point where the very famous letter from a Birmingham jail that he writes is also in this Aquarius period. And he then shifts into Pisces. So when we go from the air sign into the water sign, this is a transition, unlike the other ones I've talked about. There actually is a common ground. They're both wet. They're both really into blending, bringing together different ideas and influences. The difference is we have that more external, sociable, intellectual air is going to slow down a bit, get more inwardly directed. And so one thing about that, that's sinking down into feelings of water, dissolving old constructs and ideas. Something's going to be kind of mutating. There could also be, greater empathy for others coming out of this, getting more attuned to like inner dreams. And going from fixed into mutable, there's going to be more of an interest in doing something different, innovating, having different directions come out, instead of being focused in so much in that fixed kind of way. And so this transition for Martin Luther King comes just months before he gives the very famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And, I just think this is a good example to show in a very public way, everything about that "I Have a Dream" speech is so Pisces, and his son had just entered Pisces, which also means from a whole sign perspective, this is where we get the sun moving into the 11th house of his chart. And so what's interesting about the period that follows this in that kind of Pisces way is he does sort of start taking on, more things. He has even bigger, Selma comes after this, but also he starts opposing the war. He starts working on behalf of all people in poverty. He starts working really directing his attention to taking on the entire military industrial complex. And obviously he has a Venus Pisces, Moon in Pisces. So there's already a Pisces quality that he has, but that's getting really sort of vitalized by the Pisces sun entering that sign. Another example of the same exact transition that I was just talking about. This is, his name is Arrington De Dionyso. He actually lives in Olympia, Washington, where I live, and I worked with him, and he was actually fine with me using his name and not being anonymous. He is a musician and an artist who is more in the realm of, experimental art and music, which also often has that sort of more underground type of label and connection and everything. So he's born with a Capricorn sun in his 6th house. This is a Capricorn sun that has a lot of really major aspects. It's opposite his Saturn. It's squaring his Chiron. It's up on his midheaven. It's squaring his IC where his moon is, squaring his Pluto. And so when he has the same experience of going from Capricorn sun into Aquarius, this happens a little bit later for him. He's more, around 15 years old, coming up to be 16. From a whole sign perspective, that sun entering Aquarius is going to activate the whole sign 7th house. It's not quite at the descendant. It's also pretty close to his descendant. But how this shows up right at this time is pretty much almost at this exact time. He meets in September of 1990, he meets the mother of his daughter, and they have this very fast moving relationship where within 3 years his daughter is born, and that lines up very close. That happens just before the progressed sun actually comes to the descendant to get more angular. And so there is a difference, the whole sign activation of the house is important to look at, but when, if you're someone that's always using whole sign, you really do want to look at where are the actual angles by degree, because something's going to really come in there. So in March of 1994 then is when this happens. And so his daughter had been born. He then moves to Olympia, where there's a college here called the Evergreen State College, where he is then going to school. He's become a father. He was already interested in music, but that gets a lot more amplified here. And within a year, he's forming his first band. He's also, Evergreen has a very active Buto, that Japanese dance motion meditative practice that he got very involved in. And his being seventh house, so a sixth house person moving into that seventh house is going to very much activate relationships and community. Moving to Olympia, Washington in the 1990s, it's just a very powerful time where Olympia was known for its underground music, especially punk and music deconstructing forms of music. Not long before this, Kurt Cobain had lived here. The K Records had been involved here this whole time. Kill Rock Stars, these well-known independent record labels. There has been a riot girl movement with bands like Bikini Kill, and the 90s were just very active with this very strong musical community and art community and local organizing of different spaces that he kind of comes into with this transition and becomes a very active member within, later goes on to help create an experimental music festival here, becomes more and more known as an artist at the same time. And he then transitions into eventually the sun going into Pisces, which brings a major shift for him. And what's interesting to me about this is I met with him more recently after his son went into Pisces. And there was one other time he reached out to me to meet with me, not knowing that during that Aquarius time, he was about to have a new moon in Aquarius. And that really went with him shifting more into this art direction. And which again, his art style is also very deconstructing of things in many ways. And he actually became pretty well known for this, and even like the fashion designer Yves Saint Laurent actually used some of his art for a fashion show at one point. So he'd had some good success with this, and he was still performing as a musician. But as part of this, one of the bands, and his band style would be, if you're familiar with like Captain Beefheart or different experimental bands like that, it's definitely sort of in that realm. At one point, he forms this band where he learns how to sing in Indonesian, and it's this strange trance kind of punk dance band in a way where he's actually doing Indonesian throat singing, and he's traveling to Indonesia. He comes into contact with different people that are in shamanic lineages. And so it's interesting, as the sun comes into Pisces, this is in April of 2020, which is right around when the pandemic's happening, all the lockdowns are happening. And he said that he decided at this point to just really go on his inward journey. He did not know that his son had just entered Pisces by progression. He was taking a lot more psychedelic mushrooms at this time. And where it's led to him now is that he's become very interested. He's still, doing art and still performing as a musician, but he's become actually very interested in using sound and his voice to do shamanic healing sessions with people. And he's actually started doing that. And it really came out of this inner exploration and mixture of psychedelics that he initiated at this time, at pretty much the exact time that the sun went into Pisces. And then, he'll be now going through that 8th house journey in the years ahead. So one thing to go through, just to show an example of how, I'm going to do this one pretty quickly with the time I have left, is I've been talking about the elements. It is possible, depending on when you're born, somebody can in their lifetime actually move through all of the elements. And an example we have of this is Leonard Cohen, who's born with a Virgo sun. In his lifetime, he went through all of Libra, all of Scorpio, and into Sagittarius. So he's born with a Virgo sun on the ascendant. It rules his ascendant. He has a Gemini, doesn't rule his ascendant, but it's conjunct his ascendant. But his Mercury in Libra rules his ascendant as well as his midheaven, because he's Gemini, Virgo rising with a Gemini midheaven. So he is an example of somebody, so that's an evening star, Mercury and Jupiter. He has Mercury and Jupiter out ahead of the sun. And so we can, in his lifetime, he would then live towards the progressed sun, coming to that natal Mercury, and then coming to that natal Jupiter. When he, you might know that before Leonard Cohen became very famous as a singer-songwriter, he was really focused on being a poet and a writer and a novelist. And so when his progressed sun came to his Mercury, this is when pretty much at the same time he gets his first poetry actually published. He was attending university. He was becoming very well known, winning literary competitions and so forth. And so that becomes really known right then for him. And then at this point, he's going on to start in the years between the sun going from Mercury to Jupiter, he is getting books published, becoming known as, and being very critically favorably reviewed as like this outstanding, the most outstanding young poet of English Canada and that sort of thing. So then as the sun moves across that second house Placidus cusp into the conjunction with Jupiter, that happens in 1963. And remember that Jupiter, he has a Pisces moon. And so Jupiter, and he has a Pisces seventh house in Placidus Orhol sign. That Jupiter rules the seventh house, it rules the fourth house, so it rules relationships, it rules where he's living. The period before this is, you might know the story of how he ended up buying this house without like electricity for the most part on this Hydra island in Greece. He ends up meeting Mary Ann, who he wrote songs about and had this sort of celebrated romantic relationship with through the 1960s. In this 1963 time, they'd already been in a relationship and had moved away, and they come back to the island to live on. And he's still getting good reviews for his writing. He actually writes and publishes a novel at the same time. The novel is all about a writer discovering themselves through their writing. And so again, we can see there's real key aspects of his life that are coming in here, connecting with the natal charts that the planets are involved in. But when he goes through his first big change, because when he entered Libra, he would only have been a couple of years old. He would have entered Libra, but when he was like 2 or 3 years old. So in 1967 is when his sun goes from Libra into Scorpio. And it was the year before this that he decided he wasn't being successful enough as a writer. He wanted to pursue music. And he eventually finds his way into the folk music scene of New York City. And by the time his, shortly after his sun goes into Scorpio, he records his first album, and his first album is released. And I really like this example just because even though he's a Virgo sun with Venus and Neptune in Virgo, and definitely has a very Virgo quality, that wherever you want to call it, persona, Leonard Cohen as the songwriter in his music is actually so Scorpio. And it's really fascinating that he artistically makes this transition into that embodiment of his creativity and who he is, as the sun's going into Scorpio. And you might notice that he has his Jupiter right ahead of his progressed sun in Scorpio. So that means the sun is coming into a conjunction with Jupiter. And so the first few albums he releases, which are all pretty celebrated albums in his catalog, are all coming out and being released as that progressed sun is coming into a conjunction with Jupiter. And in fact, when the exact conjunction happens, it's in December of 1970, and he would have just finished recording the album Songs of Love and Hate, which is his third album, and it's released shortly after that. This is also when he goes on his first really big tour, where he goes across, the United States and Canada and Europe. And again, we have seventh house of big relationships, also the third house of traveling and movement happening here. And just one example of a lyric, I think, that goes so well with like this Scorpio Jupiter. I mean, if you're not familiar with his music and his lyrics, they can be very spiritual and spiritual searching, but there's also like an eroticism and intimacy and relational quality of Scorpio that's really involved. And this from that album, the lyrics are, I came upon a wedding that old families had contrived, Bethlehem the bridegroom, Babylon the bride. Great Babylon was naked. Oh, she stood there trembling for me. And Bethlehem inflamed us both like the shy one at some orgy. And when we fell together, all our flesh was like a veil that I had to draw aside to see the serpent eat its tail. So again, just like, yeah, very Scorpio, Jupiter quality coming in. And if you look at then at the same time that's happening, they're coming into an exact trine with his natal moon. And as that's happening, he's also continuing he has a lot of relationships that are then feeding into his lyrics and so forth. And around this time, the director, Robert Altman, puts out a movie that's featuring his music, that the music is very pivotal in and brings kind of more attention to him. And then as far as the sun keeps going in Scorpio, once it gets to about the point at 12 degrees, that's coming into form a sextile with that Venus-Neptune. An interesting alignment with that is his album Recent Songs, which he later goes on to say is he likes this album the best. And he had a really bad experience on the previous album with Phil Spector and Joni Mitchell, who's a past relationship, very Venus-Neptune person, had introduced him to this producer where he got more kind of command of what he was doing. He brought in these Middle Eastern European musicians and band that they actually ended up touring together too. And there's something really nice there about that sun sextiling to Venus Neptune and things really solidifying and coming together. And then the next big transition happens in the early 90s when his Venus in Scorpio and his sun form a conjunction. The key point here, just for time, I'm going to skip over some of this, that there's very much like a culmination of a lot of, an album that comes out with a lot of popular big songs that he's known for, like the Anthem. They could put on movie soundtracks. He's publishing a book that's collecting things over his career. But there's something interesting about that Venus in Scorpio in the third decan of Scorpio, dying, regenerating, something about, this deep desire he has for spirituality and his own life and desires. Soon after this is when he very famously retreats from public life, and he actually goes into a Zen center where it leads into 5 years of seclusion. And you think 5 years, if you look at that sun, 26 Scorpio, that's about the time it's going to take for it to go to Sagittarius, which is basically what ends up happening. When by the time it gets to Sagittarius, he's still actually at that Buddhist monk center, became more involved, actually even took on a name that it translates as meaning silence. But as the sun comes into Sagittarius, it's also kind of marking this internal shift, which is going to bring him back into public life. He is involved this year in selecting songs to put out another best of music album that had previous unreleased music. And it's within about a year or so, he gets much more actively coming back into being involved in putting out songs. And by 1999, he's actually coming out of the monastery, back into public life. I'm just checking with time. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is ways to break up. You might notice, when we're talking about the sun goes into a new sign. You have like 30 years of the sun in that sign, and it might not seem like it's a lot of changes or ways to kind of really break that down. There are ways to do that. One way that some people like to use is looking at the Egyptian bounds or the terms. If you're familiar with that, the signs are broken up according to different bounds, and you could track, the sun moving through the bounds of Jupiter versus Saturn versus Mercury. I'm not going to be talking about that, but that is something that you can do. The thing that I've actually found that's really powerful and works incredibly well is a technique called the 12th parts. It's also been known as a dodecatomoria, and in Jyotish, it's been known as a Dwadasamsa. What you do with the 12 parts is you break each zodiacal sign down into the 30 degrees. Basically gets divided into 12 equal parts of 2.5 degrees. So within each sign, all 12 signs are within that sign. And if you've never heard of this before, if you go to the astroseek.com free program, they will calculate the 12 parts for you in your chart. The main idea, just to get across here, to make it more simple, is not to actually get caught up in what degree the 12th part you're talking about. As the sun's moving through a sign, so let's say that we have the sun moving through Virgo. From 0 to 2.5 degrees of Virgo, it's going to be Virgo. From 2.5 degrees to 5 degrees, it's going to be Libra. 5 to 7.5, it's going to be Scorpio. As you get more into this, there's ways to realize that when you get to 10 and 20 degrees, it's the other elemental triplicities. It's always 10 is always going to be the next Earth sign, 20 is going to always be the next Earth sign, and 15 is going to always be the opposite sign. But if there's a new, there's ways over time that you can, it seems really complicated at first, but once you start looking at this and paying attention to it, there's actually like an order that it gets easier to kind of figure out. But what I want to just do is just show how this can work. So this is somebody else I've worked with that I've changed their name to Joan. And this is showing that using whole sign. So for this technique, I really think you need to use whole sign. You don't have to actually, but I find it works a lot better and easier. That way you don't have to worry about what degree you're talking about. You're just talking about whole sign, the meaning of the whole sign, and the sign changing. So this is when showing that she had so she's born with a Cancer sun in the 11th house. She then went through a long period of the sun being in Leo in the 12th house. And then she comes into a period here in 2016 of the sun entering Virgo, coming out of that whole sign 12th house. It has not come to the ascendant, but again, in whole sign, you'll see that definitely the transition to that whole sign first sign does bring in a first house, 12th house to first house transition. In her case, not long before this, she'd had a really tragic miscarriage. And as part of dealing with that, she decides to go to massage school. And she had actually been interested for a long time in going to get a master's of fine art in writing and creative writing. And she is a writer. But sort of because of the events, moves into this massage direction. And actually in pretty much the same month, just barely before this, earlier in October, she starts this massage school. And that takes her mostly through the Virgo 12th part piece that we're going to talk about here. But as she's doing this during this, so this is all I'm talking about here, the sun in Virgo moving through the first 2.5 degrees of Virgo, she starts having energetic openings and realizing that she can do this really powerful energy work. As in addition to massage, she becomes increasingly interested in astrology to the point she takes her first and completes her first astrology course. And then what happens is it gets to about 2.5 of Libra. So when the sun gets to 2 degrees and 30 minutes of Virgo, in a way we can think about now there's a Libra 12th part being activated. And there is a theme now that we can think about. What is her whole sign of Libra? The whole sign is 2nd house. She has Pluto there. That is ruled by Venus in Cancer in her 11th house. So we can still be talking about the fact that she has a progressed sun in Virgo, and there's a new moon in Virgo that just happened that's really important here. But I have seen this with myself and just other people. There's definitely some other hidden internal shift in meaning of these 12 parts that just can be very revealing, and they really, in a really uncanny way, will line up with the person's experience. So you end up getting these like 2.5-year segments. And basically in this Libra transitional part, she's been in this one long-term relationship that ends. While she's in this part, she eventually comes into relationship with another partner who becomes a long-term partner. which is like her best, most positive relationship. She moves to be part of that relationship, and he has a big friend group in this Venus in 11th house way that becomes this really powerful friend group for her. She also is continuing to learn astrology. In this period of time, she starts, doing astrology consultations. She's, earning money in that Libra second house way. She also takes jobs working for political campaigns, calling people, and especially this is during the election where it was Donald Trump versus Biden, as well as some other congressional elections. And she was calling different voters, for example, like in Arizona, and convincing them, like Republican voters, for example, to vote Democrat. So it's very, very Libra in that way, and very Venus in 11th house, but also like earning money through it in that way. And then, once the sun gets to 5 degrees, she's going to move into a Scorpio period, which is then going to go on for another 2.5 years. And she's actually still in this period. But this period, among other things, right as she enters this period, her partner had a death of a parent. That was a difficult experience. There are also some other difficult emotional experiences that happen with family members. That kind of goes with a Scorpio kind of way. But at the same time, these events are also leading into deeper intimacy with her partner. And they were living separately. And there are some really difficult events that then happened where somebody tried to break into her apartment. She'd had a bad experience with a stalker in her past, and she was really fearful of a stalker reemerging. And then, being afraid of being in her apartment, goes to stay with her partner. But then his apartment actually is set on fire. So it's got, at Scorpio third house in a Uranian way, just like these unexpected, difficult events. But what this actually creates is they end up then moving in together and living together. And that's been going really well in a positive way. At the same time, an old friend, which is very like third house, suggested she'd be really good at being a peer counselor, and she trains and gets certified to be a peer counselor. And that's starting to get going now, where she'll be able to work in that. And then at the same time, especially third house with writing and communication and Scorpio, her North Node being there, as she's come into this house in this period, she's returned to her older interest in being a writer, and started taking writing classes, and is now working on a short story and a novella idea. And that's kind of been re-emphasized by the fact that her Scorpio moon by progression, also entered Scorpio, kind of doubling down on that. But anyway, I just wanted to bring in that technique. I'm going a little faster because I know I'm out of time. But I'm happy to answer any questions about that. It's just a way that I've found this 12th part technique to be just an extra thing you can bring in. It's not necessary, of course. You can just be looking at where the person's progressed sun is moving, but breaking it down into the 12th parts, it can definitely be really revealing as you go through that. And so I also just want to mention that in case you're interested in secondary progressions later in the year, from September to October, I'm going to do a course, and you can subscribe at my website. Just hit the button to follow me by email, or just follow me on wherever. I'll be announcing more details about this later on. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Gray. What an absolutely brilliant presentation with some fantastic chart examples. Thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant. So do you have some time for some questions? We've got quite a few, so forgive us if we don't get to all of them, but we'll try and go through. So there's a few here we've probably condensed down. If we go back to Rosa's chart, which you talked about before, do you use transits to the progress chart? So for example, we have some great astrologers as our attendees who noticed that the upcoming eclipse at 29 degrees, I think, of the progress sun is coming up. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, And in fact, that was trying to get to her chart. Yeah, in fact, that's something I did talk to her about when we met, because we met more recently, a few months ago, back in January, I believe. Yeah, so that definitely, the fact that eclipse is coming in there, you definitely can bring that in. And I was thinking about just really even more activating these the different things going on in her life. Definitely not just activating that, but just making that entrance into Taurus even more powerful. Not sure what else to say about that, but you definitely can. There was something else. So, I mean, another thing that was happening during some of this, you might have noticed on one of the previous ones when the sun was, we all lived through a Saturn-Pluto time. So that Saturn-Pluto conjunction was actually, squaring her Mars, Saturn, Pluto. And so there's different periods where we've had some really powerful alignments that were definitely hitting her natal chart and also hitting the progressed placements at the same time. And you definitely do want to bring that in with the way you're working with somebody.
Fantastic. Thank you. We've got some very eagle-eyed, fantastic astrologers in our chat today. So also there's a couple of questions around software. So which software do you use, the settings that you use, some questions around that. So what do you use?
Yeah, for these examples, I'm using AstroGold, because I have a Mac and I use that. And I like AstroGold for secondary progressions because you can animate the chart. And I know when I was first learning astrology a while ago, before I had any programs, I'd use astro.com, and I'd always be trying to put in all these progressed charts, and it'd be so time consuming. And if you have a program like AstroGold, you can just animate the chart with the progression. So it makes it really easy to see the movement of progressions across time. So that's a great program. Like I mentioned, if you're interested in that part about the 12 parts, AstroSeek, a free program like AstroCom, AstroSeek is a really great one that has a bunch of extra things if you're a traditional astrologer, especially.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for sharing. So a couple of extra questions here. Do you relocate progress charts at all? I
don't.
Okay. That was a simple answer.
Yeah.
Relocation of charts. Do you ever look at the progress chart as a standalone chart by itself?
Yes, you can. But I primarily use it this way. And that actually also opened up a whole thing I'm not going to get into, but the way different astrologers, especially the progressed ascendant, there's different settings on programs, and different people have different opinions about which one to use. In case you know what I'm talking about, I have actually come to find the solar arc longitude calculation works really well for the ascendant. And it was really kind of by accident because AstroGold defaults to that. And then I was just starting to notice it more. But some people are really into like NIBOD, and there's all kind of, I don't want to get, there's a whole bunch of different ones, but you can do that. But the thing is, you then have to figure out which one of the calculations you want to use to calculate the ascendant and that sort of thing. There's choices there you have to make. And like most things in astrology, people have different opinions about which one you should do.
Plenty of opinions out there.
Yeah.
So what orb do you use when you're using from secondary progress to natal?
Right. Yeah. So I think there was an example of this here. Really the closer the better. I would definitely say in general, once you're with like the sun, it's going to be much more powerful once it's within a degree, and even like closer and closer. But like the way this works with people's stories, though, you might have noticed with some of the examples I was trying to give, is that it's not always so exact. So yes, like things can hit exact to the day sometimes. Like I had a progressed new moon before I knew about secondary progressions, where I made this major move and change in my life to the exact day that the progressed sun and progressed moon were conjunct. But it doesn't always happen that way. But yeah, definitely, I would go with the sun more like a degree, like as it's coming within a degree, it's really intensifying. And as it's passing away by a degree, that's going to be a more focused period. You could certainly get down closer to that with the orb of the sun. But I think a degree is good.
Wonderful, wonderful. We have a question, an interesting question about asteroids. Do you use them in your practice and in terms of stationing or progressed? Do you work with them at all?
I do use asteroids, and yes, you can bring them into progressions.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And I've seen interesting things with same thing, almost to the day, interesting progressions with asteroids. Yeah, they can definitely show up.
Great question here. Have you written any books using the techniques you've been talking about today? Have you got any planned?
I have not, but thanks for asking. Yeah, I think this is something I would maybe eventually do. It's funny, I just gave this a talk for ESAR Star Club on Mercury and secondary progressions, and someone asked that too. So I guess that might be something to put on my plate as my goal board, so to speak. But no, not currently. But that'll be a long-term plan, maybe.
Wonderful, wonderful. Let's see. We've got so many questions coming in. Forgive me if we don't get to every single one. Let's see, because some of them tie in together. Conjunctions, oppositions, and hard aspects to retrograde natal planets. How would you interpret the effects onto natal retrograde planets?
Yeah. So okay. Here we go. Here in this example I was using, we have the retrograde Mars, retrograde Saturn, retrograde Pluto. One thing that makes me think, I do think of the retrograde as being oftentimes more, I do think they can be more internal, more kind of going against the grain, more countercultural. I think there's something here with this person, Rose, who, as this is happening, has difficult ancestral issues that she's needing to work through. And she is not only dealing with those issues in a very eighth house way, she's actually finding like Saturn teacher mentor figure, Saturn Pluto teacher mentor figures to come in to assist her as she moves through the sun, forming that opposition to the retrograde Saturn and Pluto.
Wonderful. And I think you've touched on this before, but the importance of progressed angles, so progressed midheaven, progressed ascendants.
Yeah. That is something to look at. Again, it does matter what progressed, especially ascendant you're using. But yes, when the progressed ascendant changes, that could mean something. We actually have an example here on the screen using this calculation. I do think that's important that her progressed ascendant in Libra is there at the same time with the Saturn. I had that example of Martin Luther King. Yeah, so his midheaven going into Pisces would sort of ahead of the sun. There would have been a bit of a shift there with like the midheaven life direction kind of idea, changing signs. Yeah, it does bring in a shift for the person. And you'll see that sometimes if somebody does actually change or do something different in that timing.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Well, again, I apologize. There's so many questions coming in. So can you just reiterate how people can find you, your website, if you want to share that one again? I think there's a few questions coming in along those lines.
Yeah, so graycrawford.net is my website, and you can follow my writing there. I do also have a Patreon if you want to support me through that. There's some extra videos and writing I share there, but also depending if you pay more, there's like monthly meetings and classes I have there. And otherwise Gray Crawford Astrology on Instagram, except there's also a fake one. Don't follow that one. It's Gray_Crawford Astrology there's a fake one that has, they threw an underscore at the end of it. So
oh wow! So keep an eye out for any imposters.
Not that one. Keep the underscores in between Gray Crawford and astrology, not outside the bounds of my name. But you can follow me there. And if you're if you're interested, there's no information about this course right now, but if you're following me or connecting with me, you'll see when I put out more information about this course if you're interested in it. And we'll go through everything, and not just the sun, but the moon and Mercury and Venus and all the planets in this.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, again, on behalf of Kepler College, thank you so much for, again, such a brilliant presentation. I look forward to rewatching this myself. So I'm going to work on editing this video. We're going to try and get this out on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And again, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending today. I hope you all, there's lots of hearts, emojis and everything coming through. So thank you so much. And again, just to reiterate, we'll have this out on our YouTube channel. And I myself will look very much forward to going over this one again. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And the chart examples, wow, absolutely fantastic. I love how you bring in people that you've worked with, also famous examples as well. Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.